Hello, I'm Renton McLaughlin in New Zealand. Each morning I wake up to the first 7 minutes of Morning Report on Radio New Zealand. It's my daily dose of propaganda and the only mainstream media I listen to. Back in early 2020, when the first reports of a so-called pandemic hit the airwaves, my baloney detectors burst into life. What I was hearing from Morning Report sounded just like scripted propaganda. I had no information on which to base my skepticism. It simply did not sound kosher. Then Trump mentioned hydroxychloroquine, and the world went nuts. It was banned from use in treating so-called COVID patients and most others in the US and France, even though it had been readily available for ages and used in Africa for around 40 years for treating malaria. Why, apart from Trump speaking approvingly of it, had there been such a massive reaction against it? Surely if there was a medical emergency unfolding, anything offering a possible solution should be looked at, shouldn't it? Though my skepticism was increasing, I still had little information and actually didn't even know the questions to ask to get helpful information. I just knew I did not trust the mainstream media on this, what little of it I heard, nor the New Zealand government, which was in lockstep with others around the world, using virtually identical talking points. Increasingly, it looked to me like we were facing a global coup, not a medical emergency. Then we had lockdowns, with all the disastrous effects they produced. The cure seemed far worse than the disease. Over the next 6 months, I slowly acquired some online sources which did not seem partisan, were hard-nosed in terms of what they considered valid data, were level-headed and so were not prone to accepting every wild claim pro or con that was flying around, and were open to correction if it could be shown they were wrong. Truth does not mind being questioned. Error does not like being challenged. Up to that point, I had not given health and medical stuff a great deal of critical thought, and basically just accepted the status quo. I was healthy and fit, though getting older, having worked as a builder for 50 years. In my early 20s, I was called up by the army. I wouldn't sign the oath of allegiance because I wasn't sure I wanted to shoot anyone, so I was placed in the medic corps, which I really enjoyed. This included basic first aid training and several weeks working in hospitals where on one occasion I sat in on an orthopaedic fracture clinic. I thought I wouldn't mind being an orthopaedic surgeon. Didn't seem too different to building, only they worked with living tissue which smoothed out any botch-ups they made. Builders have no such luxury. That began a lifelong awareness of general medical stuff, treating various wounds, etc. Dr. Daddy, my kids called me in those situations, but it was all pretty superficial. Then 2020 hit, and I began researching medical things. I know I'm not alone in this. Numerous people I've come across in the last 18 months who had accepted the status quo as I had began critically evaluating claims being made, which led on to a re-evaluation of things which had been accepted without question. I've been reading scientific papers for going on 50 years relating to a contentious area of thought, so I developed critical evaluation skills along with an unwillingness to simply accept the pronouncements of so-called experts. For me to be persuaded, any person had to present solid information and persuasive arguments for the position they espoused. The fact they had a PhD or was said to be an expert didn't impress me. The field of expertise of so-called experts is generally pretty narrow, so once they stepped outside of that, we were on a level playing field, and their expertise gave them no advantage. I've also had many big-name scientific PhDs stay with us. Oftentimes I would spend a week with them, getting to know them at close quarters, so know that despite their qualifications, they were just human beings like the rest of us, with foibles and biases, and not some unquestionable gods. So, although I'm not a scientist, nor the son of a scientist, I've developed a scientific questioning mindset about most things. One advantage of being a builder is that every day one is dealing with in-your-face concrete items and facing tangible, real-world, down-to-earth, rubber-meets-the-road problems that have to be solved and can't be fudged. Don't take account of the real world and your project will collapse, leak, look terrible or not work. Many who deal with abstract ideas or policies, such as people in governments, etc., have no such immediate check on their proposals. Disasters resulting from foolish, unwise, ideological decisions may not be seen with clarity for years, and so the promoters of those ideas and policies go on their sweet merry way and seldom have to face the consequences of their folly. So anyway, one thing led to another, and I've ended up formulating 4 basic questions to get to the guts of the so-called COVID issue. These 4 basic questions can also be framed as 4 basic assumptions accepted by virtually everyone, but seldom, if ever, acknowledged, questioned, investigated, or evaluated. I've asked these questions of people I thought would know, or at least thought would be interested in dialogue regarding them. To my surprise, I found they were not interested in addressing them. Worse, they were dismissive of me for raising them, assuring me the science was settled, and how could an intelligent fellow like you even be considering such things? I was not asking these questions so I could get to know the answers, because having done research, I knew the answers with increasing precision and clarity. I raised them so that I would get a challenge to them to see if they stood up under fire and to get advocates of the COVID narrative to supply their evidence. They never have. Let's not kid ourselves. These 4 questions or assumptions open up what can be highly technical stuff. So I'm not surprised many lay people freak out when they're raised, because they simply don't have the intellectual or evaluating tools to assess them. I confess I don't have the technical knowledge to understand everything that's being addressed. But I learned a long time ago that if I persevered, I could read technical papers and get the bones out of them. In short, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to get the gist of what's going on or to ask questions of what is being proposed. And you certainly don't have to fall down and worship in submission at the feet of so-called experts in their tech talk. These 4 assumptions are scientific questions, and thus no emotion or aggression needs to be involved in evaluating or answering them. I've got no stake in them, so I don't have any emotional connection to them. Science, of course, is all about asking questions, challenging claims and paradigms, and seeking to disprove things. Science has nothing to do with consensus. It's not a numbers game. Thus, claims that this is true because the majority of scientists agree on it are not scientific claims. Ruling paradigms held by millions can be overthrown by one single person providing evidence that refutes it. But plenty of people seem emotionally connected to this issue. They may have bought the narrative, and questioning it for them is unthinkable. They may have made a faith commitment to believe the pronouncements of so-called experts or government spokespeople, liking their persona, their smile, or the way they wear their tie. They may have had the jab, participating in this rite, expressing their faith commitment, like baptism, so have a personal stake in the matter. Actually, I found that very few people at all can put ideas outside of themselves, as it were, and discuss them dispassionately. If none of the 4 assumptions I outline are legitimate, especially the first 2, it renders all policies and all activity worldwide that stem from these assumptions void, no matter how many people accept them. And it logically follows, if this is so, that we are facing one colossal global scam. So what are these 4 assumptions? 1. That the claimed virus has been isolated, purified, and thus shown to have a real existence. I'm fully aware the vast majority of people, even most of those who are very concerned about the effects of the vaccines, the massive violation of rights going on at present, and the rapid growth of tyranny, accept the assumption that the virus has indeed been isolated, purified. The existence of viruses as disease-causing agents is deeply ingrained in our culture and has been for around about 140 years. However, the number of people who adhere to a belief does not determine the truth of the belief. Very few, if anyone in New Zealand, has done original research to attempt to establish the existence of the virus. Everyone just believes someone else, who believes someone else, who believes someone else right down the line. For example, my MD brother-in-law said, "I trust MedSafe," the body charged with testing the safety of vaccines, drugs and medications in New Zealand. I'm also fully aware many claim isolation purification has been done, from so-called fact checkers to writers of original papers. However, if you read the original papers, it's clear they never even attempt to isolate the virus as per the usual meaning of the term isolate, that is, separate out from everything else. Check the methods sections of any of the original papers and you will see that what is termed isolation involves taking some body fluid, normally sputum, a mixture of saliva and mucus coughed up from the respiratory tract, filtering it somewhat, then putting the remaining soup in a cell culture of monkey kidney cells, called Vero cells, bovine fetal tissue, various antibiotics, etc., and watching for a few days to see if the host cells die or there are structural changes in the host cells, what is called the cytopathic effect. If this occurs, it is said to result from a viral infection of the cells. Obviously, there's no isolation in the normal meaning of the term in such a procedure. Apparently, and almost unbelievably, no control experiments have ever been done until recently to see if the cytopathic effect was really the result of viral infection and not something else. These recent control experiments showed that exactly the same effect could be obtained without any supposed infectious agent being present, that it was simply an artifact of the experimental method. But regardless, no original experiment apparently has ever isolated, purified, separated out from everything else a SARS-CoV-2 virus. They have all used the method outlined above. Now, if it has never been isolated, how can you know it exists? I'm not saying viruses don't exist or that SARS-CoV-2 doesn't exist. I just want evidence they do, specifically SARS-CoV-2. So if anyone knows of any original research that shows that the virus has been isolated, purified, separated out from everything else, I would really like to know of it. Please provide links to it in the comments. To date, I'm not aware of any, and nor are people who have done far more research than I have. 2. That the claimed virus is the causal agent in a disease. Again, I'm aware the vast majority accept that it is, but as above, the number of adherents to a belief does not determine the truth of the belief. Determining causal agency for a disease is a difficult thing to do, and thus, in the late 1800s, Robert Koch formed his Koch's postulates as a way to go about this. People are dying all the time, but the fact that people die does not necessarily tell you anything about what caused them to die. In regard to so-called COVID, there are no symptoms unique to the claimed disease, so no symptoms can be used to identify it. Observing symptoms and death, etc., are simply observations and do not establish causation. Most people claim to have COVID are perfectly healthy and have no symptoms at all. I have a friend who said his uncle in England had died of COVID. I asked how he knew it was COVID. He tested positive. How old was he? 85. Did he have any comorbidities? Yes, this, and this. I forget the specific conditions he referred to. He was 85 with comorbidities, so was probably at death's door anyway, and yet because he had tested positive, they say he died of COVID. Correlation does not prove causation. One thing the acceptance of this assumption most certainly has done is produce widespread fear, even terror, throughout the population, spread by the pervasive fear porn pouring out from governments and the mainstream media, which in New Zealand carries the government's diktats with little criticism. The mouth of Sauron. Add to this fear of the claimed disease, the fear and the stress of losing one's job if not vaccinated, thus losing income and the means of feeding families or paying for a mortgage, plus being locked away from normal social activities and healthy pursuits, and you have people not only rendered susceptible to illness but to powerful manipulation. In this state, they are induced to slavishly obey and comply with obviously absurd requirements, such as social distancing and mask wearing, which are a constant reminder of the claimed deadly threat they face. If they submit to such absurdities, what other things, and perhaps evils, will they tolerate, while thinking they are being righteous and good? Mass psychosis. Again, if anyone knows of any evidence to prove this assumption that the claimed SARS-CoV-2 virus is the causal agent in the claimed disease COVID-19, along with the methods used to determine this, I would like to hear of it. I have not heard any to date. 3. That the claimed viral genome used to identify the claimed virus and so-called variants, identify infected people and produce appropriate vaccines is a real-world genome and not simply a computer construct. No whole genome has been extracted from a viral particle, which implicitly confirms that the virus has never been isolated, purified. If it had, they would have extracted the genome directly from it rather than go through the dubious process they do. This is without question quite a technical field, but highly simplified, the procedure is something like this. They extract and select from the cell culture short genetic sequences called reads out of the 50 or so million such sequences in the soup. And remember, in this soup are monkey, bovine, human and bacterial and fungal genetic material. They have decided that the viral genomes are around 40,000 bases long, so choose enough reads to give them that sort of number. And then they string them all together in a computer and voila, there you have it, the viral genome. But is it a real-world genome or simply a computer construct? Once again, the vast majority implicitly accept the assumption that it's a real-world genome, whether they know of it or not. But that fact does not tell you anything about the truth or otherwise of it. If this point is disputed, please supply links to the research that proves the viral genome is a real-world genome. I've no stake in it, and I would like to hear what others have to say. 4. That the PCR test is a legitimate diagnostic tool for determining that a person has an infectious disease, specifically COVID-19. Kary Mullis, the inventor of PCR, explicitly, forthrightly and repeatedly said that PCR was not a diagnostic tool for infectious diseases and could not tell you whether you were sick or not, or had a disease or not. And yet this procedure, which is apparently very useful when applied correctly, has been used, 1, as the only means by which to determine if a person has so-called COVID or not, 2, as the means to destroy the economies of countries all around the world, including destroying vast numbers of businesses, 3, to induce people to conform and submit to various government dictates, and 4, as the means to strip people of their rights as enshrined in numerous national and international charters designed to stop just this type of abuse. These charters include, in New Zealand, our own Bill of Rights along with the Nuremberg Code. So there you have it, 4 basic assumptions behind the whole COVID situation that are seldom acknowledged or evaluated. Now to finish. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a Russian dissident who lived under the Russian communist regime. On the 12th of February 1974, the day he was arrested and the day before he was exiled to the United States, he published a piece entitled "Live Not by Lies," which is available online for download. Václav Havel, a Czech dissident who became the Czech president after the Velvet Revolution in late 1989 in Czechoslovakia, took up Solzhenitsyn's "Live Not by Lies" theme and published an essay he entitled "The Power of the Powerless." This can also be found online. Be encouraged to read both of these essays, which speak of surviving under a totalitarian regime. Could something like the tyranny Solzhenitsyn and Havel lived under, or as occurred under Hitler, happen again, even in New Zealand? Tyranny takes different forms. Some have made a distinction between hard totalitarianism, as occurred in Russia, Czechoslovakia, Germany, and soft totalitarianism, which appears to be developing in Western countries at present, utilising the fear and the panic produced by the so-called pandemic, though I think soft totalitarianism could morph very quickly into hard totalitarianism. Human nature has not changed, and the history of humanity has largely been one of tyranny in one form or another. The lust for power and control is very strong in most of us. There's no reason to think that a country such as New Zealand would be immune to full-on governmental tyranny. There are many things occurring that should be ringing loud warning bells. 2 years ago, no one would have believed this possible. Today, it's not unbelievable at all. Evil is real, though sometimes it's masked by smiles and calls to be kind. And those who implement tyranny oftentimes think they are righteous and furthering the common good as they carry out atrocities. Resist tyranny. Do not comply. Adopt the maxim, live not by lies. And as the New Zealand National Anthem says, may God defend New Zealand, even though we don't deserve it.
Men of every creed and race, gather here before thy face, asking thee to bless this place. God defends our free land from dissension, envy, hate, and corruption. God our state, make our country good and great. God defends New Zealand.
That